Do you hear about the guy whose girlfriend was a square root of minus 100? She was a perfect 10 and totally imaginary.
Welcome back to What You Will Learn. My name is Adam Ashton.
And my name is Dr. Adam Jones. Today we are interviewing with Dr. Karl, who's a real doctor. And, mate, he's a superstar. He's one of both of our most favourite persons in the world, probably one of the most clever and intelligent people I've ever come across as well.
Yeah, this is round 2 with Dr. Karl. 12 months ago we spoke to him as well, and this time we spoke to him about his brand new book, Vital Science. We talked a lot about climate change, a little bit about space, a little bit about being a genius, etc.
Yeah, all that stuff, renewable energy storage, getting off coal, all that kind of green, kind of left hippie kind of stuff, but which is extremely important.
Yeah, 12 months ago, man, I wasn't on it, but I'm on it now. The world's cooked.
Yeah.
We need to save it.
Let's go and save the world with Dr. Karl. We'd like to start with one of the big themes in your book this year, Vital Science, and last year, the Karl Universe and Everything, is this idea of climate change. So I think a good place to start is how the greenhouse effect actually works, because from my understanding, you wrote about this a long time ago as well.
Yeah, it's complicated. So what happens is the sun is really hot in the centre, but the surface is about 5,000, 6,000 degrees, see, and it broadcasts its power, the sun's power, at us. And so when the sun is directly overhead at the equator, about half that power, roughly half a kilowatt, comes out as heat, and the other half of the power comes out as light. So the light we see, but the heat we don't see, and it heats up the ground to about 15 degrees C, and then the heat goes back up. So on the way in, with the heat at a temperature of around 6,000, 5,000 degrees centigrade, the carbon dioxide does not interact with the infrared. You can do the physics, and so basically just passes straight past it, doesn't see it, it doesn't interact with it, it's invisible to it. But when it hits the ground, heats up the ground to about 15 degrees C, then radiates back up into space, and at that temperature the carbon dioxide interacts with the heat returning to space. So the heat just heads out into space, and assume there's no carbon dioxide there, you end up with a balance depending on how close the Earth is to the sun and various other factors. With the carbon dioxide there and other water vapour, which we won't go into, and other greenhouse gases, we won't go into that right now, but when it comes up and hits the carbon dioxide, it gets absorbed and then it gets re-radiated. If it got re-radiated entirely into space, well, there'd be no change. Comes in, the carbon dioxide goes out, but the carbon dioxide radiates out the heat in all directions. And roughly half of it goes into space, and roughly half of it goes back down to the ground. The amount coming down to the ground right now is around the heat output of 400,000 Hiroshima bombs per day. Every day, 400,000 Hiroshima bombs worth of heat that would previously, pre-industrial revolution, have kept on going on its way into space, comes back down to the ground. And of that heat, and we've measured that on the ground with the air temperature going up, and we've also measured it from space with the satellites picking up less heat coming from the Earth into space over the last 30 years. But of that heat that gets reflected down, only about a small percentage stays in the atmosphere. 93% goes into the ocean. If all of that heat stayed in the atmosphere, the air temperature would be, 70 degrees C, and we'd all be dead. But 93% of it goes into the ocean, and we've measured it heating up the upper levels of the ocean, the top kilometre or so. It hasn't worked its way down to the lower levels. And so, interestingly enough, the denialists, when they read this, said, aha, the scientists have said that the so-called heat from carbon dioxide is not heating up the lower depths of the ocean. That's right, we said that. It's heating up the upper levels, the top kilometre, and they conveniently ignore that. So the denialists are actually going out of their way to deliberately cherry-pick the evidence. Yeah, so that's how the greenhouse effect works.
Is there it sounds like people have known this for a long time.
Yeah, it goes back over a century, over about
Wow.
2 centuries, and people started talking that it might be visible in the atmosphere. By visible, it might be apparent. And in the early 1920s and 30s, there are articles saying, well, we are burning an awful lot of carbon dioxide, but a lot of coal and other fossil fuels, but there's no way that we'll actually do anything in the near future. And they didn't account for the absolute almost exponential increase in the amount of coal and other fossil fuels that we're burning. And so we did actually burn enough, and then it fits in with the mathematics. So we began to see it first. I started reading The New Scientist early on, and in the early 1970s, there were articles saying, it might happen, might not happen. 1973, Munich Re, the world's largest reinsurance company. So there's insurance companies who insure you and me, and then there's reinsurance companies who are the big boys, and they play with the other insurance companies. So whenever an insurance company takes on an insurance policy, it also takes a policy the other way in case there is a flood. And so they try to balance their bets. And Munich Re, RE, is the world's largest reinsurance company. In 1973, it said there's something going on, and we're just going to start factoring this thing, these increased incidents of bad weather insurance events, into the premiums. Now, just a little diversion here. With regard to tobacco, it's well accepted now. Everybody knows it, except for a small number of people who deny it, including Nick Minchin, who was a senator. He denied that tobacco was bad for you. And he's also a climate denialist. But we all admit that cigarette smoking is bad for your health, and the longer you do it, the worse it is. The insurance companies started doing something about it before the doctors. It was factored into insurance premiums. Now, it was nothing personal. They'd say, hi, Adam, you want an insurance policy? So, what? Oh, you smoke cigarettes? Okay, you're going to die sooner, therefore you'll have to pay more. Nothing personal. It was just business, because you're going to die sooner. And they saw the dangers of cigarette smoking before the medical people officially wrote a statement saying, yes, it is really bad for you. And in the same way, in 1973, they said we can see what they call then the greenhouse effect, then call global warming, then call climate change. We could see it happening on Earth. We're just charging more for it. The scientists, the climate scientists, they needed more evidence. You'd think you'd need a lot of evidence, you're going to charge more people for it, but the scientists had a higher burden of proof, and it took them until 1989 before they said something along the lines of, this episode of global warming is real, because there have been previous ones, and they also said this one is caused by us. It's not one of the natural ones that happen. And they said it's going to get really expensive. And from 1989 to 1991, the fossil fuel companies didn't do too much about it. They had emails in the background. They admitted among themselves that, oh my God, you look 30, 40 years down the line, it's going to get really messy. It's going to get really expensive. It's going to get really bad. And look up the New York Times. You can get 1 month's subscription for free or $2. I forget which. And look up the Exxon emails. And the fossil fuel companies basically said, look, this greenhouse effect is real. Geez, what are we going to do? Option one, we change ourselves from an energy company that gets its energy from fossil fuels to an energy company that does not get its energy from fossil fuels. This is obviously the right thing to do, but it's going to get messy, and it could get complicated. And some of us might manage to navigate our way through to being huge energy companies, fabulously wealthy, and others might not. And the option number two was, let's do business as usual and mount a very well-funded cover-up campaign. So they went for option two. You can read about it in the book Merchants of Doubt by Naomi Oreskes, Oreskes.
Wow.
That's absolutely crazy.
Unbelievable.
And if you said that 1989, that's still, we're 30 years down the track, and I feel like there's still no major solution, that we're still almost going down the same path.
Oh, well, okay, you're right. Let me just do a little diversion before I come to that. First diversion, now you're thinking, how could a fossil fuel company or a big company be immoral? Well, big tobacco is still immoral, and saying that secondhand smoke doesn't hurt. Look, vaping's not really bad. And big alcohol, well, in the month of August in the year 2018, advertisements appeared all around Australian hospitals saying it is not known if smoking is bad for a woman who is pregnant.
Oh.
The exact opposite is true. It is known that smoking is bad. Now, this is big alcohol. So they were perfectly prepared to tell lies. Nothing personal. They didn't deliberately want that your spouse would, I'm talking to two males here, both called Adam, that your spouse would have a baby with fetal alcohol syndrome, a long philtrum, that's a big distance between the bottom of the nose and the upper lip, and various mental disabilities. They don't specifically want that your spouse should have that. They're just in the business of selling alcohol. And that'd be just collateral damage. No overall moral involvement. Mm. And as you were saying before, I rudely interrupted you there, Dr. Adam.
Yeah, I feel like I'm just off. I feel like on one hand, it's sort of like that. Obviously, insurance companies and big corporations, they've got this immediate, direct financial incentive, as opposed to individuals and governments who it's somewhere down the track we need to do something, but there's not that immediate, direct impetus to make change.
Yes, well, I wrote about this in one of my previous books, about how 1% to 2% of the population have psychopathic tendencies. They don't have much empathy. They're totally immoral. They'll do you over whenever they can. They can be really charming. And where they end up depends on a 2x2 grid of whether they're intelligent or not intelligent, and whether they're violent or not violent. And if they're intelligent and not violent, they'll end up rising to positions of power in government, in academic institutions, in corporations, because they have no morals. And if you think back in your past, you'll probably think of somebody who did something bad to you and you've thought, why? No reason.
They're just psychopaths.
Yeah, I can get away with it. And they're kept in line by the laws of our society. So you've got this weird situation now in Victoria where if you as an individual kill a cat, you can go to jail. But if you as the boss of a big corporation allow unsafe working practices that allow a human to die, you'll get a fine.
That's unbelievable.
Well, it's time for... So the trouble is that corporations have got so big that they're now as big as some governments. And in some cases, if they pay to a re-election fund for a political party, the numbers are they get about 1,000 times back. So you put in $10,000 to re-elect this party or that party, and you get $10 million back in tax rebates. And so they kind of own the parties, and the parties don't necessarily reflect what the people who voted for them wanted.
Unbelievable. Yeah, and I think we read in a similar book, it was saying how the corporations are obliged to do what's best for the shareholders rather than what's best for the general public, and the shareholders are kind of like one step back, not really caring about what the corporations are doing or who they invest in. So if they're legally obliged to do the best for the shareholders, sometimes if you're meant to dig oil under a reef, the best thing you can do is for the shareholders is to dig that reef up, grab the oil. But as a whole, for society, it's a horrible thing to do.
Well, yes and no. Read the book by Dennis, D-E-N-N-I-S-S, called Econobabble. I've forgotten his top name, but there's Richard Dennis. Thank you. Econobabble, and you'll find that in fact they're not legally obliged.
Okay.
To do the best for shareholders. There's an obligation to do good for the shareholders, and it's changed from the corporations used to put a lot of money into planning for the future, and maybe 20-30% went into dividends. Now it's virtually all going into dividends. So they're not really planning for the future and investing in the future as much as they used to. And there's a whole lot of things he talks about. But you're right, the corporations now have a huge amount of control over government policy. And so governments are there for the long term, or used to be, and now not so much.
Fantastic.
So which is why I tell people, you don't like what's happening in politics, run for politics yourself.
Yeah.
We'll definitely get to that.
You sold us on the idea last time we were here.
Yeah.
We'd like to get back to this.
Was I mean picking on you? I'm sorry.
No, definitely encouraging.
It was great. It was a kick up the arse, I guess.
Well, if you spend a lot of time shouting at the TV, you're wasting your energy, man.
Definitely.
So earlier you talked a little bit about the climate skeptics.
Yeah.
A few of the big reasons they're skeptical would be that the Earth's always been warming.
And cold. Yeah, it's been through many cycles. So if you look at it over the last 600 million years, roughly every 150 million years, we have a big chill. And we think this is related to the Earth's orbit around the centre of the galaxy, where it goes up and down, crosses the big gas dust lanes in the middle. And so we had big ice ages now, 150 million years ago, 300, 450, 600. 600 million years ago, it was snowball Earth. But then once the ice age happens, then you have the shorter term thing of the Milankovitch effect, which then brings the ice ages on regular pulses, the mini ice ages. And so from 3 million years ago, oh, by the way, the three factors involved from Milankovitch effect, Milutin Milankovitch, a Serbian astronomer of the 1920s. The three factors are, number one, that the Earth's orbit changes on a 100,000-year cycle from circular, kind of circular to kind of more elliptical and back again, 100,000-year cycle. On a 42,000-year cycle, roughly, the angle of the tilt changes between 21.5 and I think 24.5. At the moment, we're 23.5, going down to 21.5. That's a 42,000-year cycle. And on a 24,000-year cycle, the Earth slowly precesses, which is a difficult word to explain without a movie. So just think of a top, and you set a top spinning, and slowly it sweeps out. While it's spinning really fast, it slowly sweeps out a complete circle. It's just tilted off its axis a little bit, and that's what the Earth does on a 24,000-year cycle. Okay, put that all together. From 3 million years ago, sorry about the numbers, from 3 million years ago to 1 million years ago, we'd have 42,000 years of ice age, followed by, 8 or 10,000 years of non-ice age. What's an ice age? Ice is 1 kilometre thick over Germany and New York. The water level drops in the oceans to make all this ice across the Earth, drops by about 100, 125 metres. A million years ago, it switched over to 100,000 years on and 20,000 years off. And about 18, 15, whatever it is, 1,000 years ago, we drifted out of the last ice age. We were going to go into the next one anytime in the next couple of thousand years, but at our current levels of carbon dioxide, it's been put off for at least 50,000 years. So these are the natural cycles, and what we've done is throw so much carbon dioxide into the atmosphere that we've started it heating up when it should be cooling down.
Nice. So there is these natural cycles, but we've completely thrown it way off. What's the future? What can we do about it in terms of either reducing the amount we're putting out, finding alternatives? What's some of the most promising things that people could or should be doing at the moment?
The first thing is that we can fix it and we can reverse it. So we can, and there's a report come out just this week from the United States government saying that it's really bad. It's going on line with the predictions we made back 5, 10, 15, 20 years ago. They're all coming true, as opposed to the denialists who deny all of them, and that we can do something about it. It's really bad, but we can do it. So the first thing is we stop dumping carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. And with electricity, we can do that in 10 years, with transport 15 years, with agriculture, which is about roughly 1/4 of the Earth's carbon, of the human race's carbon dioxide output, with agriculture and livestock, and we can reverse that, we can stop that in about 30, 40 years, because the animals and the plants have DNA and they'll try and fight us. But we can do it. And there's other things we can do. So we can very quickly get to not putting any carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. And you say, but that's impossible. Think of the 7th of December, 1941, Pearl Harbor. And within 9 months, in America, the number of cars being made for the domestic market was 0, and they'd switched over entirely onto a war footing. And so they were pumping out things like the big B-17 bomber, a huge thing, crew of 10, could fly a couple of 3,000 kilometres there and back at 400 kilometres an hour, carry a big load. And they were pumping them out of just one car factory, and there were lots of car factories, at the rate of not one a month, one an hour. Right, okay. So that brings us to the second stage. So firstly, we go into the war footing, and we stop putting carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. We just go renewables. And then secondly, we pull the carbon dioxide back out of the atmosphere. And already in Switzerland and other places around the world, there are companies who have come up with machines that do this. In the case of the Swiss one, 25 million machines will pull out the entire output of carbon dioxide for 1 calendar year from the human race back.
Wow.
How do
25 million. Now, 25 million is a big number, but we make about 70 million cars every year. All we have to do is say, this is our priority and we're going to do this. And where we're going to put the carbon, well, we're going to put it back where we shouldn't have got it from in the first place. It was dumb to take it out. We just put it back. It'll cost more than taking it out. Now, the thing is that you're going to say, well, it's expensive. It will be expensive in the short term, but cheaper in the long term. And think back to slavery as an example of the fossil fuel companies. When slavery was finally banned in the United States and the United Kingdom, here's a rhetorical question for you. Who do you think got compensation? Was it the slaves or the slave owners?
I'm guessing the
Slave owners. Yeah.
And were they doing the right thing? No. Were they immoral? Totally. Did they get compensation? Yes. Did the slaves get compensation? No. What's going to happen is that the fossil fuel companies will say, oh, we're no longer making $400 billion a year. Give us some money. Rack off. Rack off, hairy legs. You get nothing.
How does that machine work to suck the carbon out of the atmosphere?
Don't know.
Oh, you know.
By the way, besides there's various different ways. They all involve energy. And besides the mechanical ways, there's biological ways of doing it as well. Biochar, etc., etc., etc. There's fungi. There's a whole lot of ways of pulling carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, and we have to do this for the good of the future generations. And it will work out cheaper in the long run. And the one way is simply one thing to consider is just the health costs. So in Australia, we think we've got pretty clean air, and in Sydney and Melbourne, you can go down to the water, and in Perth, you can see the sun rise or set over the ocean. You can't do that in Asia because the pollution is so bad. You can't do it in Europe. In Europe, you can't see it happen. I sort of make it a little habit, a little fun game. Each time I come to a new city, to go to the tallest building and then sit there at sunset and watch the sun set. And it's wonderful. You see the traffic flowing out. You talk with the locals, how you're going, where you're from, and then you see the traffic flooding back in after the sun's gone down. In Europe and in Asia, the sun vanishes into a cloud of pollution before it kisses the horizon. In Europe, it's about 1 sun diameter. In Asia, it's about 2 or 3. We're so lucky. But okay, the point is that even in Australia, with our clean air, in Sydney and in Melbourne, in each city, over 2,000 people die every year from air pollution caused by burning stuff. Burning stuff is bad for the lungs. It's kind of like cigarettes are bad for your health, or the earth is a sphere. You know, it's pretty obvious, but nevertheless, we're still burning stuff. And we just have to stop it and it'll work out cheaper.
Yeah. One of the things we absolutely love to burn to create energy is coal. And from what I understand, as we try and get off coal, we need to replace something with a baseload power so we can use renewables like the sun and the wind and everything like that, which is good for like the peak electricity or the which isn't the baseload power. But what do you think is the best solution for using energy storage to actually capture the wind and the sun for when it's not blowing and it's not sunny?
Okay, question without notice. You've heard about Snowy Mountain Hydro 2. How many places do you think? How many locations are there in Australia where we can use stored hydro power? Give me a number.
100.
Other Adam?
I guess.
I'll go lowball. I'll go 20.
22,000.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. So there's a whole bunch of different renewables, 17 roughly. For example, between Australia and New Guinea and Indonesia is 10% of all the tidal energy on Earth. 10%. The amount of that is captured is zero. Right, okay. So if you go to the University of Melbourne and look up their zero carbon plan, you'll see 2 documents, one for 2 meg, which took me 2 hours to read, one 10 meg, a bigger version, of course, with more detail, took me 10 hours to read. There's 17 renewables, we can use them, and they can cover the entire world. We don't need to go nuclear, and we can provide baseload with it. For 2 weekends running, last weekend and the one before it, the electricity has gone down in Australia's capital city. So 2 weekends ago, I was coming back from Canberra. We went to a town called Collector. The electricity was down. Couldn't have a coffee, only have gas, and we were talking about renewables. And then yesterday, I saw a tweet from that Nobel Prize winner, Brian Schmidt, who helped discover dark energy, Vice Chancellor of ANU, said the grid went down in Canberra for and I didn't notice for 3/4 of an hour because the sun and the solar cells and the batteries on my farm kept me going. So in Australia, right near the very centre of power, the capital city, on 2 successive weekends, the grid fell over. This so-called fair dinkum power fell over. So there's 17 renewables. So there's one Spanish island that became the first island in the world to go totally renewable, and they use 2, which is stored hydro and wind turbines, which are kind of married. So the wind blows because where it is. You see, the renewables you use depend on where you are. And the other side of the coin is we've got to have a worldwide grid of electricity. It'll come. And so on this island, they use electricity, they use the wind to make electricity, which powers the island, and also pumps seawater into a convenient extinct volcano. Not everybody has a convenient extinct volcano, but if you do, use it. And then when the wind slows down, then the water comes down and keeps them going. You just use what's local, and you need some more thinking. And the thing is, the health costs are enormous. So in China, one very big reason, the Chinese are going to become the world's first renewable superpower is the health costs. And there was a paper talking about the costs of their Hawaii River policy, which is to give free or very cheap coal and electricity to everybody north of the Hawaii River. And the cost to the society was that 500 million people lost something. 500 million is a big number. It's about half of China's population. And what the 500 million people lost was 5 years of their life, right, from the dirty air. So my son's been in China where you couldn't see 30 metres in Beijing. Right, and they had to stay in their hotel room with the filters going on the aircon, and even then their eyes were still stinging all day, all night. Right, okay, so it's not as bad as that in Australia. And so if you're looking at losing 5 years of life expectancy, well, in the 5 years before they died, they were incurring significant health, medical, hospital costs. In the 5 years before that, they probably weren't working at full efficiency, so you're losing effectively 15 years of working life out of a 40-year span. That's nearly half. That's kind of crazy to do that in what the Chinese have is a planned economy. Now you're thinking, hang on, but they're a dictatorship. They can get away with this sort of stuff. Well, just remember the words of Abraham Lincoln. He said with regard to democracy, you can fool all the people some of the time and some of the people all the time, but if you can fool half the people one day every 4 years, you've got a democracy.
That's awesome.
I like it.
So the Chinese are going down that pathway simply because they're losing about 1/3 of all of their worker output from dirty air.
Ridiculous.
Exactly.
Crazy.
But if you've got a company that can then get 1,000-to-1 return on paying for the re-election campaign, well, luckily in China, I'm using the word luckily, in China there is no re-election campaign. We'll just leave that the way it is. Not going to even talk about that. That's a different thing.
I saw an ad on TV recently saying Australia's got this clean coal and we're exporting this clean coal. Australia's got the best coal. Is that just absolutely ridiculous?
It's like saying black is white. Yes, it is correct. It is totally ridiculous. If you burn coal to make carbon dioxide, then you're making carbon dioxide. Maybe what they're referring to is the different. They're doing cherry picking of the truth here. You can have coal being brown coal, which is full of all sorts of crap, all the way up to, I think, anthracite, which is not thermal coal that is burnt for heat, but rather met coal for metallurgical purposes, for making steel. And so It's got very few impurities, so maybe they're saying, oh, well, we've got this coal which is 99.9% carbon as opposed to 60% carbon, so it's clean coal.
It's like we've got the healthiest cigarettes.
That's right. We've got healthy cigarettes because they've got pig writing on them or something. Something totally illogical.
Yeah. Another thing from your newest book is fuel and saying hydrogen as the future of fuel.
Oh, and Bertha Benz.
Yes, it was a good story. That was a crazy story.
Did you like Bertha?
Yeah.
I fell in love with her. I couldn't believe it. Okay, so the story goes that way back in the late 1800s, the internal combustion car had not arrived. The automobile had not arrived. And there were various people trying, and one of them was Karl Benz, as in Mercedes-Benz. And he was a really clever guy, but he wasn't into test driving. He was more of, I got this idea, let's tinker with it, and let's drive it for 20 metres. Okay, that works, let's go for another, now let's try something else. And his wife was saying, no, you got to do a proper test drive. And so finally, on an unknown August day in the year 1888, early in the morning, she got up with her two sons, having left behind a deliberately confusing note saying, me and the kids, I and the two kids, we've gone off to see my mum. And she didn't point out we've taken your car, the car. And by the way, she was an engineer herself. So this was the first car, the Power Wagon 3. And so they rolled it down the driveway because it was noisy and then started up and then off they took. Well, there are a few problems because he'd only ever driven it. Well, firstly, she was going to try and drive 100 kilometres to see her mother, but there was no road. You see, there were tracks for horses and wagons, but the wheel tracks didn't mean, the wagons didn't fit up with the wheel tracks of the car. So she just took any road. There were no road maps, so she went the wrong way because there were no road maps for ordinary people to buy like you can today. And off she took. And then one of the first problems with the car was that there was no fuel tank. It just had a big float level, in the carburettor, but it was a big one, and so she then had to stop at every single chemist shop on the way and knock off their benzene, and they wouldn't sell it to her because the benzene was being used as a dry cleaning fluid, and she was just buying their entire stock, and so she did that. And there was also a problem. There was no oil pump because what do you need an oil pump from where you drive at only 20 metres? And so she had to keep on throwing oil into the top of the engine, go straight through out the bottom and fall on the road. And there was no sealed radiator because what do you need it for when you just do a short drive? So she kept on having to stop and get water. And it didn't have enough power. So this engine, about 1.5 litres, nowadays they'd have anything from 100 to 250 kilowatts. This thing had about 1 and a bit kilowatts. It had less grunt than your iron that you used to iron your clothes with. And so it wouldn't go up hills. And so the kids had to get out and push. And there was this extremely steep hill where she had to get some shepherds, and they all pushed up the hill. And she said then to her husband, well, you got to get yourself a gearbox with a lower gear in it. Obvious things that you realise after a while. And then the brakes were just wood pressing on metal, and they had two characteristics. Firstly, they didn't work, and secondly, they wore out really quickly. And so she cut up the handbag and got some leather and made the first handbrake, a proper foot brake, and then got to her mother, then came back again. And the publicity was enormous, and then suddenly the company got really wealthy and it just took off. Now, think about the fact that she was taking the car for a test drive on a car without a petrol tank, no oil pump, no sealed radiator. There were no roads, there were no road maps, there were no petrol stations. That is the challenge facing us with aircraft. Aircraft are essential. Aircraft generate about 2 to 3% of the world's carbon dioxide. We've got to switch them over to run on something else. We're heading for batteries, but for the heavy lifter where you're taking a couple of hundred people halfway around the world, you're going to need some sort of liquid fuel with a high energy density. Little detour here. Talking about energy density, you see in the news that the price of oil per barrel has gone up to 70 or 100 or down to 50 or whatever. A barrel of oil has the energy of 2 strong people working 5 days a week, 8 hours a day for a whole year. So you can buy the labour of 2 strong men for about $1 to $2 a week. It's a bargain. That's why fossil fuels took off. Now, to equal the energy density of 1 kilogram of petrol, or as the Americans foppishly call it, gasoline, to equal that energy density, you need, in the old days, half a tonne, 500 kilograms of lead-acid batteries. Half a tonne. But now we're working our way down to 100 kilograms, and with the good lithium batteries, we're getting down to 50, down to 30. Lithium air batteries get up to about 10, but they're in no way commercial. It's not like you can put them in your car right now. They're very experimental, but we're heading down that pathway. So with aeroplanes, you need a high energy density to get across, and the fuel is, I'm saying hydrogen. And the planes, now the thing about hydrogen is that, number one, it's got this incredibly high energy density, 4 times higher than kerosene. Kerosene is jet fuel, There's kerosene A, kerosene B, or jet fuel A and B, and one's better for lower temperatures, it doesn't freeze up. And kerosene and hydrogen has 4 times the energy density per mass, which is good, but per volume, it's 1/6. So you need 6 times the volume of kerosene in hydrogen. So you need 6 times as much volume of compressed hydrogen to have the same energy as the kerosene. And what that means is we go to the heavy lifters like the 747 and the 380, and we reconfigure them that half of the fuselage is used for fuel and the other half for humans. So you halve the payload of humans, but you can still carry a bunch of humans halfway around halfway around the world, and you can still do commerce, shifting of parcels, all that sort of stuff. It's just that we have to think differently. But that's impossible. You say, what about Bertha Benz, who took off in a car that didn't have a petrol tank, an oil pump, or a sealed radiator when there were no roads or petrol stations? She did it, we can do it.
I think that's a good example, a good analogy for one person, Karl. He's got the idea and he keeps tinkering on the idea, whereas Bertha actually put it out into the world and decided to test it.
Yeah.
But one thing I want to mention, I've just started, in the 12 months since we last spoke to you, started working for this Israeli fuel company that's doing hydrogen fuel, but not compressed hydrogen. So one is obviously compressing it to 700 times atmospheric pressure. This is like using water as a carrier. So the mixture is liquid stable. It's 60% water, 40% chemical mixture, mainly a salt BH4, and it reacts with the catalyst to release the hydrogen.
And where's the hydrogen stored? It's joined onto...
so it's BH4, so half the...
A B for boron?
Yeah, boron, yeah.
So one boron atom marries itself to 4 hydrogen atoms? And then does this then float in a liquid solution, does it?
Yeah.
And how much energy do you get per mass, per kilogram of water,
I should have got the numbers. Hey.
Okay, because what we're trying to do is get the highest energy density possible.
So they say that they're going to achieve twice the range of compressed hydrogen at 700 bar.
For the same volume?
For the same volume,
Oh, well, okay.
And without the safety concerns of compressing hydrogen and the expense of the whole ecosystem being super pressurized.
Oh, sure. That costs energy. We're just working out how to do it, and we'll get there. So I remember there was a huge change in cars from around 1990 when the computers came online. Became available to be small enough to put into a car. And at the same time, in that 10 years, around 1990, we put a huge amount of knowledge, of brain power, into working on car engines, and suddenly they got this incredible jump in efficiency and power. So as an example, I actually had one car, Mitsubishi Lancer, for a quarter of a century. It had a 1400cc engine. I just loved it to pieces. That was after I got out of the big American Iron into this small car because it was more reliable. I know, boring. But and then after a while, I ended up driving a university car. Now, here we go. The university car had an engine that was nearly 3 times the size, 2.5 times the size, the engine. The power was about 3.5 times as much as my Mitsubishi Lancer. The weight of the car was twice as much, and the fuel economy was the same. Wow. So that's how we went. We massively increased the power output and the fuel efficiency and the cleanliness. The engines got much cleaner. And there was a 10-year window and it just suddenly all happened at once. And we'll go through the same thing with hydrogen and with batteries once we start applying human brain power towards it.
Yeah, awesome. In your book, and this is something we talked about last year as well, was the idea of space travel. And in your book, you say how it's been one of your dreams your whole life to travel into space. With all these improvements in technology and iterations in a lot of the energy density and all these things we're talking about now, what do you think the odds are of yourself actually still going into space?
That depends entirely on how much the politicians make it happen. Because in some parts of the world, as Mao Zedong said, power grows out of the barrel of a rifle. And in other parts of the world, power grows out of the parliament, out of politics, out of politicians. That'll depend entirely upon where the politicians decide to put our energies, and that's you guys. I actually had somebody ring up a radio show saying, look, we're spending too much money on space travel. We should instead be putting it on improving the planet. And I say, look, I agree with you about improving the planet. Let's look at the hard numbers. So around the world, out of a world budget generated of about roughly $80 trillion, that's how much the whole world generates each year. Out of that budget, the fossil fuel companies get 6% given to them for free as a subsidy. Out of every dollar, they get 6 cents given to them as a subsidy because of their power. The peak that was spent on space travel for the Americans was 2% of their budget in the 1960s. Worldwide, it's down to about 0.02% of the budget. So if you're comparing fossil fuel companies and space travel, you're looking at about 400, 500 to 1. So do you think that we should concentrate on stopping space travel entirely and let the fossil fuel companies keep on getting 6 cents out of every dollar as a subsidy because they control the governments? And the guy said, well, I'm just going to have to check that, which is dead right. Don't trust authority. Nullus in verba. Don't trust authority. Check it up for yourself. Go to the source.
I was thinking you were going to mention, what are your thoughts on the private sector, looking at things like what Elon Musk is doing with SpaceX and Jeff Bezos with Blue, what was it called? Blue Origin.
Something. They're building on the hard work that the government agencies have done around the world, plus they're getting subsidies, massive big contracts. So this subsidy thing is interesting. So in the early days of integrated circuits for computers, the big companies that were making these highly sophisticated chips for the military were being paid $100 each for each chip, regardless of whether it worked or not. That's called a subsidy. But because of that, the Americans were able to get this massive advance and get this massive lead in highly sophisticated electronics. So to some degree, Musk and Bezos are still getting subsidies, but their way of thinking is good, and the reusable spacecraft is brilliant, but there's a limit to what you can do with rockets getting into space. So for long-term space travel, we have to get past the current situation, which is basically where you get a big cylinder full of something that goes bang, put some humans at the pointy end, light the wick, and 8 minutes later you're in orbit 400 kilometres up, doing about 27,000 kilometres per hour. I like the ladder to space to get us up there. So you get a geostationary satellite, extrude a cable to Earth, and then one the other way to counterbalance it. And 36,000 kilometres long, then you just run electric cables up it. You run sort of elevators up it. And then once we're in space, we need to get the fusion engines so that we can squirt around the solar system at about 1% of the speed of light, 1/10 of the speed of light. That's where I see us going long term.
That sounds absolutely crazy, but phenomenal.
Well, I'm excited. I really want to go to.
Think back to the 13th of December, 1903. No, 17th of December. 17th of December, 1903. I think that was the date that the Wright brothers had their first controlled artificial flight. Now, imagine you go to the parents of a newborn baby and say, "Guess what? Your baby is going to see humans walk on the moon."
Yeah.
Right. Okay. We did that in less than one human lifetime.
Yeah.
We can
absolutely.
do it. We humans are great. We've just got to be allowed to expand. The trouble is we've got this philosophy at the moment where the big businesses are taking over. So if you read the Oxfam reports, in the year 2010, to equal the wealth of the bottom half of the planet, the poorest 3.5 billion people, to equal their wealth, took 343 billionaires in 2010. By 2016, it had dropped down to 8. All of them male, all of them white. Now, I'm sure it's a coincidence, but 343 and 8 are both cube numbers. So 7 cubed and 2 cubed. I don't understand the philosophy. That's just coincidence. I think
next is 1 cubed.
Yeah. But I find it useful to get the big picture. And the thing to realise here is that when people talk about in the economic pages and so forth, when they talk about the money trickling down to the poor, no, it's being sucked up. So I'm old enough to remember that you could run a family on one person's wages, buy a house, buy a car and have an overseas holiday once a year on one person's wages. Now, you've got 2 people working and it's not 37 and a half or 40 hours a week, it's longer than that and they can't afford to buy a house. Right, okay, we've been screwed. Oh, the toys are cheaper, like TVs are cheaper and some cars are cheaper, but the important stuff like education, like housing, like welfare, medical costs, they're way more expensive. We've been screwed. And the way to get it back is for you guys to become politicians.
Fantastic. Well, you spoke a lot about that last time and this time as well, and it sounds like that we do need good people going into politics.
Yeah, because people say, I'm not going to go into politics because they're all crooked. Yeah. That's right. If you don't go in there, the crooked people will remain there and they'll still be crooked. If you go in there, there'll be one honest person.
What's the first steps, or what does going into politics mean? What does the normal 22-year-old Joe or Jane sitting on their couch thinking, this sounds like a good idea, I should go into politics? What should they be doing?
I don't know. I went in a really dumb way by getting angry at the TV and going out with being... So a politician came on TV and said, look, we got voted into power because we said we put in a railway line, but now we're not. We're going to put in buses because buses carry as many people as trains. And at that stage, I then started to run for the Climate Change Coalition, and it cost an awful lot, but I had a great education. I don't know, maybe not everybody has got the personality for going into politics, but support people who will, make it a point to get a world view. Not everybody... here's a little diversion. In Australian politics at the moment is particularly nasty, and they'll tell lies about you. And they say, if you can't take the heat, get out of the kitchen. And it's kind of like saying the biggest bully wins. And I think we need to call those people out for being absolute ratbags and bullies and misogynists as well. So maybe join a political party just for fun. As a low-level worker, and just see what goes on. Study politics at university. Go for local council. I don't know, just instead of shouting at the TV or the news,
take the responsibility.
Or support somebody. But be aware that you need to get good people in politics, and there's many different pathways, and I don't know what they are.
Yeah.
I do remember talking to somebody who had studied politics at university, and their knowledge on a theoretical level was huge. And if you combine that with actually working as a low-level grunt, where you keep your big mouth shut and you keep your big ears and your big eyes open, you learn a lot, and then you can walk away from them. And it doesn't hurt to work in the belly of the beast, as long as you keep your morals. I've worked for some particularly nasty organisations and learnt an awful lot from them. So maybe dive in and just learn from how they are really behind the scenes.
So that was awesome general advice about politics. With education so expensive now, and at the same time the whole world changing at such a fast rate, what do you think, what advice would you give to people today if they want to learn and have a great career? Probably another way of framing it is, would you go down the same path that you went of having the education in electrical engineering, biomedical, and going down the university education so strongly?
I'd go with whatever works now. I was lucky enough to grow up in a time when the Australian government, wait for it, this is really funny, they thought education was a worthwhile investment in the future.
Not anymore.
well, nowadays, education is a short-term profit and long-term loss. And so if you look at the latest OECD report, Organisation for Cooperation and Development, of the 35 countries involved, the one, and they're looking at massive disparity between the poor and the wealthy, Australia is fourth, not from the top, from the bottom. Oh my God. So in Australia, we've got probably the highest percentage of involvement of students in private schools, about 30%. The rest of the world is about 10%. And secondly, we've got the weird situation where, I think this is right, Australia, the federal government in Australia is the only government in the world that gives more money to the private companies that have private schools than it does to government schools.
Wow, that's bizarre.
Yes, it's bizarre, isn't it? And then if you look at what works, and you go to the Scandinavian countries and Germany, what works best is a free government education system where all of the money is spread around evenly. So that doesn't work. So what you could do is go to Germany and get your degree there. It doesn't hurt to learn another language. Maybe before you go and pick up other languages, do a course here in Australia on grammar. Because if you're going to learn the Romantic languages, such as French and Italian and Spanish and Romanian, you need to know grammar. And you'll say, what's the difference between a past participle and a subjunctive and a future tense? I don't know any of these words you're telling me. So it's not hard. You can just learn it.
Yeah.
Get an education, work, keep your morals, make mistakes and realise that you're going to make a mistake. Try not to make the same mistake more than once. Twice is okay. 3 is getting to be a bit of a habit. And I've made a few mistakes. I've made lots of mistakes on the way. And on the other hand, when you make mistakes, always admit it as soon as possible. Don't try and cover it up.
Nice.
I do that. I've made mistakes on air quite a few times, maybe once every 2 or 3 weeks, where I get out, I actually say something that I genuinely believe is something, and I'm wrong, and people bring it to my attention. And I thought, my gosh, how could I make that? How could I be so silly? I bring it. I apologise for it the next week and try to set the record straight.
Yeah, but listening to you, you always, if you don't know, you say you don't know, and then from there, admitting that you don't know, you can actually learn. But if you assume that you know everything, then what can you learn?
It's so hard. People have great difficulty in saying they don't know. And I love this in science, where people say, now, you're familiar with the quantization of the PDF levels of boron, and you just say, no, tell me. And you throw the obligation on them to tell you, and suddenly you're getting a very good education that would take you 2 hours on Wikipedia. You're getting it in 5 minutes from them.
Yeah.
And then you say, hey, I don't get that bit, and say, it's the best thing you can do to say, I don't understand that, say it again in a different way.
Nice. I think that's come to the end of our serious questions. I've got some less serious,
goody, lay 'em on me.
lighthearted ones.
Yeah. Which is buy my latest book. You don't have to. You're still my best friend. That's Vital Science. It's got weird stuff in there like cockroach milk, and how every planetary body in our solar system that has a hard surface and an atmosphere also has sand dunes. So Venus, Earth, Mars, Pluto, they've all got sand dunes. And Titan. Yeah, okay.
I love it. It's crazy.
And next comment or question, silly question time. Yeah, later on. There are no silly questions yet.
The first one is to throw Adam Jones under the bus.
Yep.
12 months ago, when we walked into your house, he'd quit coffee, quit gluten, and quit dairy. And you showed him the light, and he's back on all of them now, more so than ever.
A little bit of coffee is good for most people. Gluten is bad for those people who generally have celiac disease, and for another 8 out of every 1,000 people who have a softer version. For the rest of it's great. We've evolved for it.
Nice.
And what was the other one? Lactose? Yeah, milk's good. Basically, you're going to lay down all the calcium you'll ever have in your bones, the maximum, by the time you hit your early 20s. After that, it either stays the same or goes down. You can't lay down any extra. You got to lay down early. So get into that milk. Milk is not bad for you. Doesn't unless of course you're like, well, for 2/3 of the world it is bad for them. They can't have a milkshake because they are lactose intolerant, and so they can have a bit of milk in a cup of tea. You see, the lactose gene arose in Hungary about 7,000 years ago, and then 4 times separately in Africa about 4,000 years ago. So if you're from that part of the world, you can have a milkshake. And 2/3 of the world can't have a whole milkshake. They can't break down the lactose into it's too smaller molecules, galactose and sugar.
Nice. I've got another lighthearted one.
Yeah.
In the 12 months since we last spoke, I've become a genius, or I was recognised as a genius.
Wow, how?
Did an IQ test, just got a high score.
So what was your number?
151.
Jeez, I'm only 110.
Well, the question...
He seems to find a way to
just
drop it into every time we record. It somehow gets dropped in that he's a genius.
This is the first time I've mentioned it. I didn't want to just mention it. The question off the back is, just having that score is pretty meaningless. What's the actual next level application of that geniusness? How do you apply the knowledge?
That's up to you. What you got to do is find... Okay, the Americans have a saying called spinning the wheels, which means you've got a really big engine and you hit the accelerator hard and then the back wheels suddenly spin. This is old American iron, and you're not going anywhere. You're burning up fuel, you're using up energy, you're not going anywhere. In my case, with my relatively low IQ of 110, just barely above average, in that 2/3 of the population between 85 and 115, I don't spin the wheels. What you need to do is it'll come to you in time. Well, I'm sorry to give you unwanted advice, but over a period of time, you'll work out where you can put your energies best and use that for good.
I like it.
I don't know what it is. No idea. You'll find that one out yourself. Maybe you'll become a rap singer or something.
Yeah, I'd say unlikely, unfortunately. We always ask authors, what books they recommend. I think you're the first two-timer that we've had on the show. So last time you mentioned Space Opera, Better Angels of Our Nature, Beyond Piketty, and Econobabble, which also came up in this.
Yeah.
Have you got any additional books?
I've got a couple. There's one by a guy called NUNN from the University of the Sunshine Coast, where he talks about how the Aborigines, the indigenous, the first peoples of Australia, there's three popular names at the moment, they had oral legends that survived accurately for 20,000 years. That's amazing. Talking about the rising of the oceans as we came out of the last ice age. I forget the name of that. And then Factfulness by Hans Rosling. That's another good book.
Great. Add them to the list. And you mentioned earlier, if people want to buy your new book, Vital Science, where should they go?
Bookshops and online. And there's an ebook as well, I'm sure. Do enjoy it. If you find any mistakes, do let me know. If you're the first to point out, you get a free copy of my next book, which may well have a mistake, and then you get a free copy of that, and so it goes on as an infinite loop.